Good night, everyone. Close your eyes. Let everything else go and just focus on my voice. Because tonight's story won't come in your sleep. It'll come in your dreams. So, as you drift off, get ready for another terrifying journey. It was a quiet evening in Brooklyn on April 5th, 2024, but something felt wrong. The apartment, old and cramped, with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, had a constant chill in the air even though the heat was turned up high. Lena, the protagonist of this story, had been living with her roommate Jenna for over a year. They had always gotten along well, sharing late-night talks over coffee, watching horror movies, and enjoying the usual college life. But recently, things had started to change. Strange things that made Lena's skin crawl. It began 2 weeks ago, 2:30 a.m. to be exact. Lena woke with a sudden feeling of unease, the hairs on her neck standing up. She opened her eyes, looking toward the hallway where the door to Jenna's room stood slightly ajar. At first she thought it was nothing, a draft maybe, but as she listened more carefully, her heart began to race. There were footsteps, quiet, slow, dragging steps. They echoed across the floor, growing louder as they approached. Lena bolted upright, panic rising in her chest. She glanced at the clock. 2:45 a.m., and there it was again. Another soft, shuffling step. It wasn't Jenna. Jenna had been asleep when Lena last checked on her before going to bed. She could hear the sound of her breathing, steady and soft, from the other side of the apartment. But the footsteps, they came from Jenna's room, and they were heading straight toward the kitchen. Confused, Lena crept out of bed, her breath shallow. She tiptoed down the hall, the silence almost suffocating. Reaching the kitchen, she froze. There was Jenna, standing in the middle of the room in her pajamas, staring blankly ahead. Her eyes were wide open, but her pupils were dilated, unfocused. She was holding a knife. "Jenna," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Jenna didn't respond. Instead, she slowly began to sway, almost as if she were dancing. Her lips moved, speaking in a soft, eerie chant. "The moon is the key, the shadows the door. Only in silence will it begin to roar." Lena's heart pounded as she stood there, paralyzed by confusion and fear. What was happening to her roommate? Jenna had never been the type to sleepwalk. "Jenna!" Lena called again, stepping forward. But the moment she reached out to touch her arm, Jenna snapped back into focus, her eyes flashing with an unnatural brightness. And just like that, she dropped the knife. Her body went limp, and she crumpled to the floor. Lena rushed to her side, her mind racing. Jenna mumbled something incoherent, something that sounded like a warning. But before Lena could make sense of it, Jenna's eyes fluttered shut, and her breathing returned to normal. The next morning, Lena tried to brush off the bizarre encounter. She told herself it had been a bad dream, or maybe her imagination running wild in the dark. But that didn't explain the lingering unease that clung to the apartment. Jenna had no memory of the night's events. In fact, she laughed it off, claiming she was just sleepwalking and that it was no big deal. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something dark was hidden beneath the surface of Jenna's seemingly normal life. For the next few nights, things got worse. Every night, at exactly 2:45 a.m., Jenna would get up, wander the apartment, and perform bizarre rituals, things that didn't make sense. One night, Lena followed her quietly, watching from the corner of the room as Jenna carefully arranged books in a circle on the floor. She muttered something in a language Lena couldn't understand, her voice growing more frantic with each passing minute. The air in the apartment felt thick, oppressive, as if someone was watching them. The next day, Jenna had no recollection of her actions. "It's just sleepwalking," she insisted again, but this time Lena wasn't convinced. She couldn't let it go. Lena began researching, spending hours scouring the internet for clues. It was then that she discovered something truly chilling: Jenna's family history. According to an old, half-buried article, her family was connected to a series of strange disappearances and unexplained deaths stretching back generations. In the 1800s, her great-great-grandmother had been accused of witchcraft and ritualistic killings. According to the article, she had vanished mysteriously, never to be seen again, but some believed she had passed the curse down. The more Lena read, the more the pieces fell into place. Jenna wasn't just sleepwalking. Something had been awakened inside her, something connected to the rituals and the family curse. One final night, Lena couldn't take it any longer. She had to know the truth. At 2:45 a.m., she waited, hidden behind the curtains, her breath barely audible. Jenna rose from her bed, moving as if in a trance. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, she was no longer alone. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a man with pale skin, hollow eyes, and an expression of pure malice. He reached out to Jenna, guiding her toward the center of the room. Jenna's body moved as if it were controlled by an unseen force. Lena gasped in horror as she realized what was happening. The spirit of her ancestor, the one who had been cursed, had returned, and now it was pulling Jenna into the same dark ritual. In an instant, Lena lunged forward, shouting her roommate's name, trying to break the curse, but it was too late. Jenna's eyes flickered one last time with a flash of recognition, then went blank. A dark shadow enveloped them both, swallowing the room in darkness. Lena's scream echoed through the empty apartment, but no one would hear it. The next morning, Jenna's body was found, lifeless, eyes wide open, her skin pale and cold. And Lena, she was never found. April 6, 2024, 3:15 a.m. The apartment at 2045 Broadway Street, Brooklyn, stands empty. But if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sounds of whispers, cryptic riddles that never seem to end. It was a typical night in Los Angeles, or at least that's what Emily thought. The city lights flickered outside her apartment window, the hum of traffic barely audible in the background. But inside the apartment, things weren't quite as normal. She had been living with Lydia, her college roommate, for almost a year. At first, everything seemed fine. Lydia was friendly, outgoing, a little quirky, just like any other student. But recently, Emily noticed something off. It started with Lydia's odd claim one night out of nowhere. "I don't sleep," Lydia had said, her voice soft but firm. "I found a way to stay awake, forever." Emily had laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke, maybe a product of stress or too much caffeine. But when she saw Lydia's eyes, wide, intense, and unnervingly alert, it didn't seem like a joke anymore. Lydia wasn't kidding. For the first few days, it was easy to brush it off. After all, who wouldn't want to stay awake and make the most of every minute? But as the days stretched into weeks, Emily began to notice disturbing changes. It wasn't just that Lydia stayed up all night, it was the way she did it. Each morning when Emily woke up, Lydia would already be sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV screen, eyes unblinking, unseeing. She never seemed tired, never yawned, never once complained of fatigue, but there was something eerie in her stillness. Then things began to escalate. March 18th, 2024, 3 a.m. Emily awoke to a strange noise coming from the living room. At first, she thought it was just the wind, or maybe a dream. But the noise persisted, a soft scraping sound, like nails on glass. She got out of bed and padded down the hall, the creaking of the floorboards almost deafening in the quiet. When she reached the living room, her heart dropped. Lydia was standing there, but she wasn't standing in the traditional sense. Her back was arched unnaturally, her body stiff like a marionette. Her hands clutched at the arm of the couch, as if she were holding herself up, and her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling like someone who had been running for miles. "Lydia?" Emily's voice trembled. Lydia turned slowly. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, veins visible beneath her pale skin. There were deep, dark circles under her eyes that made her look like something straight out of a nightmare. But the most terrifying part was her smile, a twisted, unnatural grin that seemed to stretch too far. "I told you, Emily, I don't need to sleep anymore," Lydia whispered, her voice strained, as though speaking was physically painful. "I'm beyond that, beyond sleep, beyond rest." Emily recoiled, not knowing what to say. Lydia had always been a little eccentric, but this was something else. Over the next few days, Lydia's condition worsened. Her skin grew pale and thin, almost translucent, like she hadn't seen the sun in weeks. Her once beautiful hair began to fall out in patches, and her eyes, once sharp and vibrant, were dull and sunken. But the strangest thing was the way she behaved. She no longer ate meals with Emily. Instead, she would sit in the corner of the apartment, muttering to herself. Her words were incoherent, rambling about never-ending nights, the price of eternal wakefulness, and the voices in the dark. At night, Emily would hear strange sounds, low whispers, skittering noises, and sometimes even a distant, hollow laugh echoing from the walls. When Emily asked Lydia what was going on, Lydia would only stare blankly at her, as if she hadn't heard the question at all. Emily's fear reached its peak on March 22, 2024, when she returned home after a late class. The apartment was dark, eerily so. Normally, Lydia would be up, wandering around, or at least watching something on the TV, but tonight there was only silence. She called out to Lydia, but received no response. As Emily entered the living room, her blood ran cold. Lydia was there, but she was no longer standing. She was lying on the floor, curled into a tight ball, her body shuddering violently. "Lydia?" Emily whispered, her voice barely a breath. Lydia's head snapped up and Emily recoiled. Her face was twisted, pale and gaunt, eyes wide open but unseeing. She had no pupils, just an endless void where her eyes should have been. Lydia's body trembled as she let out a low, guttural growl. "Help me," Lydia whispered hoarsely. "I can't stop. I can't stop the hunger. It's too much." Before Emily could react, Lydia lunged forward with unnatural speed, grabbing Emily's wrist with a force that felt like iron. Her skin was cold, like death, and Emily could feel her pulse racing. In that moment, she realized the horrifying truth. Lydia hadn't just stayed awake. She had become something else. Her sleep-deprived body had begun to deteriorate, both mentally and physically, but something darker had taken its place. Whatever Lydia had done to herself had unlocked a force that was beyond human comprehension, a force that had drained her soul, leaving her, a hollow shell of her former self, forever locked in the torment of never-ending wakefulness. "I can never sleep again," Lydia rasped, her voice cracking as her fingers tightened around Emily's wrist. "I can never rest, and neither can you." The room grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around Emily. She could hear faint whispers now, coming from all directions. The darkness in the room began to crawl, the shadows twisting unnaturally, and Emily realized there was something else in the apartment with them, something that had been brought to life by Lydia's cursed desire to stay awake. Lydia's smile returned, wide, unsettling. "It's too late," she whispered. "We'll never sleep again." March 23, 2024, 4 a.m. The apartment at 1982 Parkview Avenue, Los Angeles, now stands empty. No one has seen or heard from either Lydia or Emily. The neighbors still hear faint whispers in the dead of night. And sometimes, just before the first light of dawn, they see two figures in the window. One is standing still, wide-eyed and unmoving. The other is curled up as though trapped in a never-ending nightmare. It was a chilly fall evening in New York City, and Rachel was just finishing her late shift at the bookstore. As usual, the streets were bustling, filled with the usual night owls and lost souls. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off tonight. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She lived in a small apartment with her roommate, Clara. They had been roommates for a few months now, and despite the initial awkwardness, they had settled into a routine. Clara was quiet, distant, but friendly in her own way. At first, Rachel thought it was just Clara's introverted nature that kept her so reclusive. But lately, something about Clara had begun to disturb her. Rachel had noticed it around a week ago. Clara never seemed to sleep. Every time Rachel came home late, Clara would be sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV or reading. She never appeared tired, never complained of exhaustion. But what bothered Rachel the most was Clara's eyes. They were always wide open, unblinking, and unsettlingly focused. It was as though she could see through everything, watching Rachel's every move, even when it didn't make sense. One evening, Rachel decided to test it. After coming home from work, she went about her usual routine, making tea and sitting on the couch. Clara was, as usual, sitting across from her in the same spot, her eyes locked onto Rachel. The silence between them felt heavy, thick with unspoken words. Clara's gaze never wavered. No blinking, no twitching of her eyelids. Rachel felt a chill creep down her spine. It was like Clara's eyes were searching her, peeling away her thoughts, watching her every action. Unable to stand it any longer, Rachel stood up and walked to the kitchen. But as she did, she couldn't help but feel Clara's gaze following her. Every step Rachel took, Clara's eyes moved, but not her head. Rachel was no longer convinced this was just a weird habit. Clara's eyes were always wide open, her pupils dilated, as though they were permanently fixed in that eerie stare. But what really bothered Rachel was that it wasn't normal, not by any means. The next day, Rachel decided to confront Clara. It had been bothering her for days, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Why didn't Clara blink? Why was she always staring? "Clara?" Rachel asked one evening after a long day. "Why don't you ever blink?" Clara tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving Rachel's face. Her expression was unreadable, like she was considering the question for the first time. "I don't need to," Clara replied, her voice soft but unsettling. "I never needed to blink. I never get tired, Rachel." Rachel felt a shiver run through her as Clara's voice hung in the air. It was so cold, so emotionless. It didn't make sense. Humans blink. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to get the image of Clara's unblinking eyes out of her mind. The longer she lay there, the more restless she became. She tossed and turned, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. The apartment was too quiet, too still, and yet she felt it. Someone was watching her. Suddenly, she heard a sound from the living room, a soft shuffle. The floorboards creaked. Rachel's heart raced. She sat up in bed, straining her ears. She could hear it now, breathing, slow, steady, and too close. Terror gripped Rachel's chest. Was it Clara? Was she still awake, watching her? Rachel didn't dare move. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching her door. The knob slowly turned, and the door creaked open just a fraction. "Rachel," Clara's voice whispered, so soft it was almost drowned by the silence. "Why are you awake?" Rachel's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But she couldn't. Her voice was caught in her chest as she saw the faint outline of Clara standing in the doorway. Clara's eyes, still wide open, still unblinking, glistened in the dim light. And then Rachel saw it, a shadow behind Clara, something that was not her. A second pair of eyes, glowing faintly, reflecting in the darkness. Clara stepped forward. As she did, her shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, elongating across the floor until it reached the bed. But it was the eyes that caught Rachel's attention. There were two now, in the dark, floating above Clara's head. Something was controlling her. Rachel finally found her voice. "What are you?" Clara's lips curled into a twisted, unnatural smile. "I'm exactly what you think I am, Rachel," she said, her voice almost melodic. "I've been watching you for days. Rachel, you see, I don't need to blink, because I'm not human anymore." As Rachel stared at Clara, the air in the room grew heavy. The temperature plummeted, and she felt her heart race. The unblinking eyes didn't belong to Clara. They belonged to something else, something ancient. Rachel scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding. She rushed toward the door, but as her hand touched the handle, Clara's voice stopped her. "It's too late, Rachel. You can't escape. Now I'll watch you forever." The lights flickered, and the apartment seemed to warp around Rachel. The walls closed in, her vision narrowing. The door didn't open, and then, through the suffocating darkness, she saw it. Two pairs of unblinking eyes staring back at her. One was Clara's. The other was something much, much older. October 6th, 2024, 3:30 a.m. Rachel's apartment at 2057 West Street in New York City remains eerily empty. No one has heard from her in over 24 hours. Some say Clara has been seen wandering the streets at night, her eyes wide and unblinking, searching for the next victim to watch. No one has dared to ask what happened to Rachel. But those who have looked closely at Clara's eyes have noticed something strange. They're no longer human. It was a typical November night in Los Angeles, the cool breeze drifting through the city, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic. For Sophie, the day had been long, filled with meetings, errands, and the usual stress of her busy life. She had been looking forward to a peaceful night in, a glass of wine, and perhaps a few episodes of her favorite show. But something felt off tonight. Sophie lived with her roommate Isla, a quiet, mysterious woman who always seemed to be a little different. At first, Sophie didn't think much of it. Isla was an artist, often staying up late to paint or work on her latest project. But it wasn't just the late nights that were odd. It was the fact that Isla never seemed to sleep. In the beginning, Sophie brushed it off as just another quirk. Some people just didn't need much sleep, right? But as the weeks went by, strange things began happening. Sophie first noticed the whispers. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, like a soft murmur in the distance. She'd chalk it up to the neighbors, maybe the sound of the TV or someone talking outside. But the whispers started to grow louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, like voices whispering in a language Sophie didn't recognize. One night, as Sophie sat reading in the living room, she heard a soft murmur coming from behind her. She turned, thinking Isla had spoken, but there was nothing. The house was silent, and Isla was nowhere to be found. Just the wind, Sophie told herself. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Then came the shadows. Sophie had been in bed one night when she heard a soft scraping sound in the hallway outside her bedroom. When she got up to investigate, she froze. The shadows in the hallway weren't right. They were moving, slithering along the walls, stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. It was as if they had a life of their own, creeping toward her. Sophie's heart raced as she blinked and rubbed her eyes, wondering if she was just overtired. But when she looked again, the shadows were still there, moving slowly, impossibly. She quickly shut her door, locking it behind her, and tried to ignore the feeling that something was watching her from the other side. The next morning, Sophie decided to confront Isla. She had to know if Isla was seeing or hearing the same things. But when she entered the kitchen, she found Isla sitting at the table, staring blankly at her cup of coffee. "Isla," Sophie said, trying to sound casual, "I've been hearing things, whispers, strange noises. And last night, the shadows, did you hear or see anything like that?" Isla didn't even flinch. Her eyes were vacant, distant. "No, Sophie," she replied, her voice eerily calm. "I haven't heard anything. Maybe you're just imagining it." Sophie didn't buy it. She had lived with Isla long enough to know that something was terribly wrong. And it wasn't just the whispers or the shadows. It was the way Isla was changing. She looked more tired than usual, with dark bags under her eyes, her face pale and hollow. Her movements had become stiff, almost mechanical, and she never seemed to blink anymore. It was as though she wasn't entirely present. But the strangest part was that every night, the occurrences grew worse. Objects in the apartment began to disappear, small things at first, like keys or a favorite mug, and then bigger items. Sophie would wake up to find her books scattered across the floor, or her coat missing from the hook. The apartment itself felt different, heavier, as though the air was thick with something unspoken. One evening, after finding a large stack of her belongings piled up in the middle of the living room, Sophie snapped. "Isla, what's going on? You've been awake every night for weeks. I can't take this anymore. What are you doing to this apartment?" Sophie's voice trembled with fear. Isla slowly turned to face her, her eyes wide and unblinking. A strange smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "I'm not doing anything, Sophie," she said softly. "It's what's happening to me. I can't sleep anymore. I don't need sleep." Sophie's blood ran cold as Isla's words hung in the air. Something about the way she said it felt wrong, like it wasn't even her speaking. That night, Sophie tried to stay awake. She couldn't shake the feeling that Isla was the source of all the strange events. As the hours passed, the house grew more unsettling. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing from every corner of the apartment. The shadows grew larger, crawling along the walls like sentient creatures. And still, Isla sat at her desk, motionless, staring blankly at her work. Then, just as Sophie thought she might lose her mind, she heard it. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was louder than the whispers, darker, as if something had awoken inside the very foundation of the apartment. Sophie jumped to her feet and rushed to Isla, shaking her. "What's happening to us? What have you done?" Isla slowly turned her head toward Sophie, her face expressionless. But her eyes, they were black, hollow, like endless voids. "It's not me, Sophie," she whispered, her voice distorted. "It's them, the ones who can never sleep." Suddenly, the apartment seemed to warp. The walls pulsed with strange energy, and the shadows stretched out toward Sophie. Her vision blurred as she felt an icy grip close around her chest. The apartment was alive. The apartment had been waiting for someone like Isla, someone who could stay awake forever, someone who could let the darkness in. The last thing Sophie saw before everything went black was Isla's face, her eyes now glowing faintly in the dark. The whispers grew louder, and Sophie could have sworn she heard a single phrase repeating over and over again, "She's one of them now." November 11th, 2024, 2 a.m. The apartment at 215 Elm Street in Los Angeles remains abandoned. No one has seen or heard from either Sophie or Isla since the night of the incident. A few brave souls who ventured near the apartment at night claim to hear soft whispers from inside. And some say they've seen shadows moving behind the windows, unblinking eyes watching from the darkness. But there's no one left to explain it. The paranormal influence has taken hold, and the apartment is never quiet again.